Hello everybody and welcome back. So in this next lesson we're going to be taking a look at the OS module. So this module is pretty straightforward. There's not too much to say about it, but before we move on to doing our actual pipeline tools, we're going to need to know how to work with it, because it's just one of those intrinsic Python modules that just always comes into play, especially if we're going to be working with our computer, not just with Houdini itself, but actually writing files, creating folders, just working with paths, anything actually on our machine, on our in our operating system, right? That's what OS stands for. We need to use the OS module. Okay, so this is all about Python, not really specifically about Houdini, but obviously within Houdini we can access all of Python, including the OS module. So let's import this module and let me just show you what we're going to do. Now, I'm not going to go through everything in this OS module. I'm sure there are absolutely loads of things you can do with it, but I'm just going to sort of briefly show you the bits that we're going to use. And then of course you can go and study it further and look more into what it can do, especially if you start doing much more complex things and using Python outside of Houdini. But I'm just going to show you the bits that you're going to need to know for now. And this kind of holds true for all modules within Python. There's so much out there that you can learn still about Python. So, just within the scope of Houdini and what it normally does, or what you would normally use it for, there's a very sort of limited scope of what we would actually use. But if you want to take it further, there is so much more to learn. Okay. So let's take a look at this. So like I said, the OS module is all about our machine. And so most of the work we're going to be doing has to do with some kind of paths or documents or something like that. So I've created two paths, okay? And they actually are paths. They do physically exist, okay? In fact, I'm going to delete this one. So we've just got I've just created sort of a test project. So there's just a bunch of empty folders, right? But and inside of one of these, I've got a text document over here with some text in it. Okay, just so that we've got a little area to play with. Okay, so you can just set your own. Now, one thing I even put it in here to remind me. You have to put forward slashes for these, right? If you have backslashes, so especially if you're on a Windows machine and you go and create your folder and then just copy, we can come in here and copy this, you'll see it's going to copy it with backslashes, and then that will not work in this context, okay? When we start using the OS things, it just doesn't work, okay? And in fact, later on, I'm going to show you, we're going to build our own little function that goes and actually replaces forward slashes and backslashes and kind of unifies them, because you come across this all the time. So we're going to just kind of, create a way of very quickly passing any paths, but correcting for it. Okay. So as long as you type them with forward slashes, they'll work for now, and then later we'll build that function. So one of the first things we're going to want to do when working with folders is to basically just check what's in there, because sometimes we want to go, let's say we want to go and read something off of disk. Well, we now need to go and essentially grab a whole bunch of references to all these files that are on disk. Maybe we want to grab a bunch of textures or something like that. So what we're going to do is use os dot and then list dir, okay? So list directory, okay? And then we feed it the path. And this is simply going to just list everything that is inside of that directory, right? Now I'm going to print this because what it's going to return is an actual printable list. So I'm just going to feed it my root here. You'll see I've called, so root is actually just the path to the actual test project that I've created. And then I've got one txt doc, which is the path to the actual text document, which is inside of root, inside of another folder, and then in that document. Okay, so I'm going to just list what's in root and let's see what we get. So there we go, it prints scenes, right? So it is literally printing the name of that folder inside of there. Okay, so that is fantastic. Now obviously we wouldn't print what's inside of this text document, because that's it's not a folder, it's a text document. So we need to do something else later to see what's actually inside of the text document. Okay. All right. Now, something we're going to often want to do as well is create folders. What if we want to create a brand new folder in here, but obviously we want to do that using Python. So there's a function called mkdir. Okay, so basically make directory, right? Now I just want to point out before we move on, this is a little confusing, but mkdir is to make one directory, and yet there is a sort of a plural of this, which is make dirs, to like make multiple directories. But I don't know why one of them is mkdir and then the other one is the full word make. So yeah, just the longer one, so the one that also has the s at the end, also has the full word. So just you can just kind of remember it that way, that the long one is long in every way, and then the short one is shortened in every way. So mkdir. Okay, so it's a bit strange. Now what mkdir does is it just is going to create a path that we feed it. So let's say we want to give it root, but we actually want to create a folder inside of that. So instead I'm going to, in here, now there is even a better way to do this, but I'm going to just show you this way for now, right? So we're going to create, we're going to use our format over here, and I'm going to feed it root as 0, right? But then after this / I'm going to give it the name of a new folder that I want to create. So something, right? And then because this does not exist, it will make this exist. Okay, so we click apply. Now it's going to print none because I actually am just printing over here, and this function returns nothing, but it acts in place, so it actually does what we told it to do, and it goes and creates a folder called something at that location. Okay, now let me delete that something folder. What if I wanted to go even deeper, right? So I want to go and say, oh, I want to create inside of my root, I want to create a folder called something and a folder called whatever. Okay, now when I do it this way, it will not work. Okay, and that's because it can't find, it essentially goes and takes this path that you're feeding it and goes one back and expects to find that location and only the last thing that you feed it. So only after the last slash will it create that folder. Okay, but that is what the make dirs, so the long form, is there for, is essentially we can feed it a full path, and all the way along recursively it is going to create the folders. Okay, so inside of this function it's actually running the mkdir function, but just recursively for everything inside of this. Okay, so now if we click apply, obviously again it'll print none because this doesn't do anything, but it creates a folder called something, and inside of that creates a folder called whatever. All right. Okay, so I think we can leave those there for now. Right. Now, something that we can also do is rename folders. Now, this one is a little strange. Well, at least you need to be very careful that what you do is always refer to the full path. Okay. Sometimes in Houdini we get used to the fact that yes, sure, we use the path to a node to create a reference to that node, but then when we rename it, we just give it a new name and we don't care about the path anymore. Well, it's not the case with this OS module. So when we do a rename function, we have to feed it the full path to the folder that we want to rename, and then we have to give it a full path to what it should be. Rather than just a new name. Okay, so we actually have to give it the exact same path, except with something else at the end. Right, and then when we click apply, okay, again it's going to print none because it doesn't print anything or doesn't return anything. But now it has renamed that folder to something else. Okay, we cannot just go and give it just a string and say, oh, okay, we'll go and rename that folder okay, which right now would actually be called something else. We can't go and rename that back to whatever like this, okay? Because it's basically going to say, yeah, that's not a thing. You know, yes, you're pointing to this folder, but you need to give me the full path that you expect that folder to now have, which includes the new name. Okay. So that's how we use rename. And then one of the most important ones, one of the ones we're going to use very often, is access. Now this function is essentially checking, it's querying and saying, you know, does this folder exist, or and not just does it exist, but can I alter it? Can I read it? Can I write it? Can I execute it? Like, is it, you know, accessible to me? You know, this is what access does. Is it's essentially checking and querying a particular directory or a file. So we can also point to files themselves and say, you know, does that exist? You know, I'm expecting to find this text document. Maybe it's a config file with a bunch of, you know, data or whatever, or a JSON file. And I have, you know, I'm basically saying, does it exist? Because if I just prep my whole script and it's saying, oh, go grab the file, read this, do whatever with it, the first thing I want to do is say, well, does it even exist? If for some reason it hasn't been created, or the user has deleted it or whatever, well, then I need to do something else, or I at least need to abort the whole process. Okay. So what we do here is we feed it a path. Okay, so we feed it, let's check our root first. Okay, we'll also check the text document. So we feed it the path, but then we also have to feed it a mode. And there are 4 different modes, that I know of. There might be more, but as far as I know, there are only 4. So, but these modes are they're sort of sub modules as well. So it's OS dot. And then the options are, now it's all capitals, F_OK. Okay. So this is going to check whether the file exists. Like, is it just, does it exist and is it accessible? Okay. Then we have ROK, which is it readable? WOK, which is it writable? And X_OK, which is it executable? Okay, so more often than not, I end up just using the FOK to just check if something actually does exist. But obviously, if you're wanting to write to a file, well, it's a good idea to check whether it is actually writable first. Okay, so if I click apply, you'll see it prints true because it has found that folder. It does exist. Okay, and let's give it the text document as well, txt doc, and say, does that exist? Yes, it does exist. I can find it, right? Now let's see, is it readable? Okay, so that is true, and let's check with root and see, is that readable? Yes. Okay. Writable, txt doc. So yes, I can write to my text file, and then executable, right? So yes, I can execute that, and yes, I can execute my folder. Okay, in other words, I can go into it. All right, so this is what we would use to basically check that something exists. And a lot of the time what we're doing is we're using it to say, well, check if it exists. If it doesn't exist, then let's create it. Now, I know you can just use the make dir function, because if it already exists, it will just not do anything. But I don't like to operate that way. I like to sort of my scripts to know what's actually happening. So I first go and check and say, does this exist? Because if it doesn't, not only do I want to create it, but maybe I want to alter certain things. Like potentially, if the folder doesn't exist, you might want to then pop up and ask the user, do you want to create this? You know, can I work with your computer? Can I actually create a folder? Are you sure that I'm allowed to do that? That's a much better thing to do than just assume and just kind of run these functions sort of brute force. Okay, so besides the OS module itself, we also have some sub modules that we're going to use, like the os.fok and everything. One of these is the os.path. So this, I'm actually going to even bring up a document here. So within the OS module, so this is just in the Python documentation, there is os.path, okay, which is a module that we're basically going to use to work with paths and you know, folders and stuff, okay. And you can read through, and they've got a lot of really cool functions, so it's always good. It's very similar to the Houdini help file. You should go through all the modules and see what you can do with them, and then, you know, yeah, so you can even go and check out OS and everything we've been working with up till now. Okay. Now I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just want to go through a few that are pretty useful. So this is essentially when we're working with actual text, so strings, right? But strings that are paths, and so it's got a bunch of functions that are designed to help us, you know, work with that a lot quicker, okay? Because it then assumes, like, it understands what an actual path should look like. For example, you know, we've got our drive at the beginning, then slashes to separate directories, and then ending sometimes, not always, but ending in a file, not a folder, with an extension as well. So it kind of understands that whole structure, and so all of these functions in the os.path module are designed to work within that structure. Okay, so the first one we're going to be talking about is os.path.join. Okay, now what join is going to do is take a path that already exists and then just join another directory or file to the end of that. Okay, so we can take, for example, root and then add our whatever to it. Okay, now just note, this is not going to be altering the folders. Okay, we are not using OS now to actually create folders or whatever. Obviously this is probably going to be used to then create folders or check folders or read from something or whatever, but we here are just working with strings. Yes, they are strings that are treated like they are folders. Like I said, the os.path understands that these are paths, but these are just strings, random strings. These could be folders that don't exist and will never exist. Okay, so they are basically just being treated in here as strings. Now when I print this, you're going to see what happens here is there's forward slashes all the way, because that's how I've typed it here, and then there's a backslash here. Okay, now this is because we're on a Windows machine here, and when it does os.path.join, what it does is it combines the sort of the root or the path that you gave it and then the folder or file that you give it, and merges them using the os.sep. Okay, so let me show you what this does first. os.sep. So os.sep is a property in this module that stores a variable with whichever separator is sort of used by that operating system. So if I print os.sep, it's going to print a backslash. And then if I went onto a Linux machine and printed os.sep, it would print /. Okay, so it's kind of it's automatically figuring out which machine you're on and setting that variable correctly. Okay, and when we use os.path, it's going to use things like that, right? Now, obviously, if I'm on a Windows machine, Windows will read this perfectly fine, okay? But obviously, for Houdini, some things may complain with forward slashes or backslashes, so it's better to kind of get them all aligned, right? So often I will take paths and actually strip them right down into their component parts and then rejoin them using os.sep. Just so that we know we're always using the separator that the operating system wants us to use, which means that also if we're doing it automatically, like using an actual function, so procedurally basically, then when we send this to, let's say, a render farm, or we could render it on the cloud or something like that, depending on what operating system is being used, it will then just swap it for the one that is expected. Okay, because like something like a Linux machine is not going to be happy with a backslash. Okay, so let's continue with os.path. I'll actually show you just now with in fact, let me while we've got it up here, let me just show you a little example. So one way that I would normally sort of split this up, right? If we take our root, okay, so let's say we're going to go and fix this. So we take root, and then we can split it at the slashes. Okay. Now, obviously, if we weren't sure whether we had forward slashes or backslashes, we would need to kind of do both. So we'd split it at the slashes, and then we'd go through each one of those and split them at the backslashes, so that we could gather a list that is split regardless of whether there's maybe even a mix of back and forward slashes. Okay. But in this case, I do know that they're all forward, so I'm just going to split them this way, right? Now, if I do that, it obviously returns just a list like this. Now I can join. And remember, with join, it is not how we would sort of intuitively expect it to be, that we operate on the list and say list.join. It is instead that we have to operate on the separator itself and say join. So remember, if we wanted to join these with an underscore, we would do that dot join, and then we feed it the list. Okay. So now when I click apply, it joins them all with underscores. Instead of giving it an actual string like this, we're just going to feed it a variable, and that variable is os.sep. Okay, so in here I'm just swapping this with os.sep. So os.sep is the string, and then on that string we're running a join function, and within that we're creating a list using root. So we point to our path and we're splitting it. Okay, and there we have it. Now we can replace, we can join that with whatever our separator currently is. Okay, so then this exact same thing on a Linux machine would print all of this, but with forward slashes. Okay, and so we're always relative to the operating system. Okay, so let's go back to os.path. So we've spoken about joining. Now there is an os.path.split. And that is very different to what I just did, where I used string.split, because that is going to split the entire string into a list based around every instance of that separator or whatever character I feed it as a thing to split by. Instead, here with os.path.split, it's splitting out essentially the path and then the actual current working directory. Okay. So if I feed it root, for example, what it's going to do is essentially give me my full path and then the last folder. Okay. Now we could do that also recursively. So that would be another way of splitting this up, basically, if you wanted to, is we could loop through this as many times as we can and separate out the last folder and append that to another list, and then we would essentially assemble a list like this of all of our directories, and then we could reassemble it using os.sep or something like that. Okay, right. And now, okay, wait, we'll keep os.path. So we've got split. We also have split extension, so split ext, right? Now, in this case, it'll obviously just do nothing. I mean, it still returns a list, a tuple, but it returns the entire path and then nothing, because there is no extension at the end of this. But here, txt doc, okay, if I feed it that one, it's going to separate .txt as my extension, and then here it separates everything else. All right. So that's a way of just checking what type of file this is by using split ext. Okay. I think there's also a split drive or something. I believe, yeah, where it'll split the actual drive and then the path. So you can use that to maybe swap to a different drive over here. Maybe you want to replace that beginning. So if you've got maybe like a mirror server or something like that, you could say, okay, on our machines we use F, but then when we go to the server or the render farm or something, it actually doesn't look at that location. It still uses the same path, but swaps this for something else. Okay. All right. So we've got split ext. Okay, so then there's another one pretty useful, very similar to kind of os.access, but here it's called isdir. So we're essentially just checking whatever I feed it. I'm saying, is this a directory or is it an actual file? Okay, so if I feed it root there, then it's going to say true. That is a directory. Okay, and then if I feed it txt doc, it's going to say false. So this is a file, this is a directory or a folder, so we can use this to essentially figure out which one is which. Okay, so if we were, let's say, recursively looping our way through this, we'd be able to go, okay, this is a directory, and then eventually we'd hit this file, and then we would know how to maybe treat that a little bit differently. Okay. And then there is also a dir name, directory name, okay, which is going to basically just return the path to the directory which whatever we're feeding it exists within. So this path to random text exists inside of this whole scenes folder. So it's going essentially one level back. If we did the same thing to our root, then it's actually going to return just up to that path, okay, because this directory exists inside of that, right? So now that we've spoken about OS, and like I said, there is much more to it, but these are the ones that we're going to use, and they're pretty basic. You know, they're pretty straightforward. But sometimes we just need to know, okay, does this folder exist? Is it a folder? Where is it? And oh, if it doesn't exist, let's create one, or let's create a file, or you know, just very basic things like working with files and folders. Now, I'm going to move on to something else that is a little bit outside of the OS module, so we're not specifically using OS, but it does sort of relate to working with files and folders. So I figured it would be good to kind of merge that into this lesson. So let's talk about actually writing to files. So it's one thing to work with these directories and folders, but what about an actual text file? Okay, so how can we read that file, get text from it, or maybe write to that file as well? Okay, so what we're going to want to do is use the open function. Now, open is not part of any module within Python. It is just in the root. Okay, so we just use open, but it is a function. It is not like when we run these sort of like when we say exec and we give it a space, right? It's not one of those. Okay, it's an actual function that we have to run, so it has open brackets. Okay, and then what we feed it is 2 bits of data. So we need to feed it the path to the thing that we want to read, of course, and then we're going to give it an access mode. Similar to with our os.access, we need to kind of define the rules of how we're going to open this file. Okay, now opening it, by the way, just so you understand the context, is not opening it like physically going and opening it, like literally going inside of here and double clicking on it and actually opening it. As in, it's not going to pop up and open, but it is sort of like Python is doing that in the background, right? Now, we can't read this unless we open it, okay? We can't write to it unless we open it. And we also, when we're done writing or reading, we need to close it, because otherwise it sits on our desktop here, it sits open, and it's chewing up memory, as well as the fact that if we've written something, we need to actually sort of close and say save, right? So all of those steps that I just spoke you through, like that's what we're going to be doing, but just in Python. So the first thing we're doing is actually opening it and creating a kind of a reference in memory to whatever is inside of that file. Okay, so we need to store this. So I'm going to call it my file. right? And then we open, so I give it the text doc, okay, so txt doc. And often what you're going to see when a string is fed into this, it's normally they normally denote it with an R in front, where it's a raw string, because you just want to be careful that none of the sort of slashes in here or whatever get interpreted as special characters instead of just reading this as a raw string. Okay, so we're going to force that to be raw. It's just good practice. You might get away with it. I think this one does work because there is no, but let's say if it was like /t for tab or /n, then that's going to treat it like it's a new line or a tab or something. So we feed it the raw document, and then we need to give it the access mode. So we're going to say, well, how do we want to access this? Now there are a few. So R, okay, like that, just R means readable. Okay, so I want to open it, but I want to open it in a way where I am only able to read and not to alter this file in any way. Okay, R plus is going to be read and write. Okay, but it's important to note that with read and write, essentially it's like it reads it first and then it writes. Okay, so it's kind of like me opening this file. I can read it first, and then when I start typing, imagine I'm basically, as I'm typing, I'm overriding these characters. Okay, so it's going to, yes, it's going to overwrite the data that's there, but it does not start with a blank slate. Okay, whereas then when we get to write, you'll see it's a little bit different. So W is write, so that means I'm going to open the file and basically ready to write it. Okay, and W plus is write and read. But the difference between write and read and write, so R plus and W plus, is that if I do R plus, it's going to overwrite the characters, but any that I don't overwrite will still be left. If I use W plus, it's basically like, imagine if you had to create a new folder, a new file, also called random.txt, filled with different text, and then paste it in here and then basically say, yeah, just overwrite this file. So it doesn't even care what's inside of here, it just goes and overwrites it completely. Okay. And then there is A, which is append, so it will not overwrite any of the characters that are in there. It will just leave all the lines as they are, but append to the end of it with any new text that you feed it. And then there is A plus, which is append and read. Okay, so it lets us read the data that is in there, but when we write stuff to it, we cannot overwrite what's already there. We can only append to the end of the text file. Okay, so I'm going to put W plus, which is more often than not the thing that you're going to use, because you want to still be able to read what's in there, but a lot of the time you want to overwrite it completely with whatever you're doing. Okay, so now we've opened the file. Okay, but let me print this. Let me print my file and show you what this does, right? So it's not printing the actual text that it finds in there. It's printing a Python object. Okay, so it's a reference to that sort of that memory footprint where it has our file opened in a certain mode. Okay, so we now can operate on that Python object in order to get the string that we want. Okay, so let's read. Okay, so it's as simple as pointing to our file dot read. So on this Python object we have a bunch of functions, one of them being read. So we can read this entire document, and if I then print it, then obviously it's going to print it over here, right? Now hold on, let's pop this open. Okay, so you see that is empty, right? Because we have opened it through W plus. Okay, if we open it through R plus, so let's go and save something in here. So this contains some random text. Okay, so okay, sorry, it's still open in here. So let's be smart here and actually close this, right? So remember, when it opens it, we need to close it as well. Okay, so now when we save this, it'll save and we can close. Okay, so let's just double check that we've done this right. So I open it, we've got some text in here, close. Okay, now Python's doing the same thing. It's opening it, but it's opening it in read plus. So it's going to allow me to read what is in there and then close it. Okay, so there we go. Now obviously we don't have to close it here after we've read, but then it stays open in memory, right? And if we're wanting to alter it in any way, so write to the file, then we have to close it. Okay, because like I say, if we write to it but do not close it, then we will not override it. So here let's open it with W+ because we want to override it entirely. And instead of reading, okay, we're going to write to this file. So we're going to say my file, and then it is just as simple as doing write. Okay, and then we feed it some other text, to overwrite with something like that. So we say, okay, this is what we want to write into that file. Okay, but if we don't close, let's take this away, right? Click apply. We come here, open it. Okay, now it's overwritten it with nothing. Okay, because it's opened through W+. So it's essentially created a new, like, it's overwritten it with something that has nothing in it. So this line has taken place, but this line has not taken effect because we have not closed it. Okay, so we have to actually open, write, and then close in order for that to take place. Okay. All right, so that about wraps up working with files and folders. These are, like I say, are very basic techniques. There are obviously much more advanced things we can do with Python and files and folders and whatever. There are loads of modules out there that do really crazy and cool things. But for the context of what we're trying to do, we really just want to do some very basic things. Yes, we want to create some folders if they don't exist, because later when we're defining a pipeline, we obviously want to have a folder structure where we store every time we create a new project. It should create a folder for us, and in fact probably a preset folder structure. So we're going to be using the OS module to do that for us. We're also going to then want to create certain files. Maybe we want to edit those files, or working with config files like a JSON file, we're going to want to write to those. Now, I'm going to be doing a separate lesson on JSON files. We write and read from them a little bit different to what we just did now. And for those of you who don't know what a JSON file is, don't worry, I'm going to explain it all in that lesson. But yeah, basically we're going to be working very basically with some folders and files in order to make a pipeline kind of function well. Right. So thank you everybody, and I'll see you guys in the next lesson.